need to introduce myself to enough of the people here, but anyway. Well, John McGahern published The Barracks in 1963, and at that time I was a student teacher in Carysford. It was the first time that I had read a book that spoke to my own lived experience, and of course I was enthralled. Then, in 1966, I met my late husband Sean, and he had grown up in Crushall and spoke with such familiarity of the town lands and place names in the books, and even knew the McGahern family. I couldn't wait to see those places with the beautiful musical names, Oakport, Gloria, Arona, and so on. So when I came to live here, I felt already at home. We lived in the Bawn then, that historic building up here to the left, with the Lenihan family, and every day I would pass by the barracks. Frank Daly, the local Garda, and his wife Molly and their family lived here at that time, and it was a warm and welcoming home. So in some ways, the writings of John McGahern have been a backdrop to my life here, as of course they have been to many people who live in the area. The piece I'm about to read describes John's introduction to reading and the Maroney family who lived in Ardcarn in that beautiful house now owned by Carol and Michael Kane. So the piece is called The Solitary Reader, and it's from Love of the World, Essays by John McGahern. I came to write through reading. It is such an obvious path that I hesitate to state it. But so much confusion now surrounds the artistic act that the simple and obvious may be in need of statement. I think reading and writing are as close as they are separate. In my case, I came to read through pure luck. I had the great good fortune when I was 10 or 11. I was given the run of a library. I believe it changed my life, and without it, I would never have become a writer. There were few books in our house, and reading for pleasure was not approved of. It was thought to be dangerous, like pure laughter. In the emerging class in the Ireland of the 1940s, when an insecure sectarian state was being guided by a Philistine church, the long, empty, grave face was thought to be the height of decorum and profundity. The devil always finds work for idle hands was one of the warning catchphrases. During this time, I was given the free run of the Maroney's library. They were Protestants. Old Willie Maroney lived with his son Andy in their two-storied stone house, which was surrounded by a huge orchard and handsome stone outhouses. Willie must have been well in his 80s then, and Andy about 40. Their natures were so stress-free that it is no wonder they both lived into their 90s. Old Willie, the beekeeper, with his great beard and fondness for St. Ambrose and Plato, is wonderfully brought to life in David Thompson's Woodbrook. Willie had not gone upstairs since his wife's death, nor had he washed, and he lived in royal untidiness in what had been once the dining room, directly across the stone hallway from the library, that dear hallway with its barometer and antlered coat rack, and the huge silent clock. The front door, with its small brass plate shaped into a stone for the doorbell, was never opened. All access to the house was by the back door, up steps from the farmyard, and through the littered kitchen into the hallway and the front rooms. David Thompson describes the Maroneys as landless, which is untrue, for they owned 170 acres of the sweetest land on the lower plains of Boyle, itself some of the best limestone land in all of Ireland. The farm was beautifully enclosed by roads which ran from the high domain wall of Rockingham to the broken walls of Oakport. The Maroneys should have been wealthy. They had to have money to build that stone house in the first place, to build and slate the stone houses that enclosed the farmyard, to acquire the hundreds of books that lined the walls of the library. David Thompson, though, is right in spirit, for Willie and Andy had all the appearance of being landless. Most of Andy's time was taken up with the study of astronomy. Willie lived for his bees. He kept hives at the foot of the great orchard. They both gathered apples, stored them on wooden shelves in the first of the stone houses of the farmyard, and they sold them by the bucketful and seemed glad enough of the half-crowns they received. As a boy, I was sent to buy apples. I somehow fell into conversation with Willie about books, and I was given the run of the library. There was Scott, Dickens, Meredith and Shakespeare, books by Zane Grey and Geoffrey Farrell, and many, many books about the Rocky Mountains. Some person in that 19th century house must have been fascinated by the Rocky Mountains. I didn't differentiate. I read for nothing but pleasure, the way a boy nowadays might watch endless television dramas. So every week or fortnight for years, I'd return with 5 or 6 books in my oilcloth shopping bag and take 5 or 6 away. Nobody gave me any direction or advice. There was a tall, slender ladder for getting books on the high shelves. Often, in the incredibly cluttered kitchen, old Willie would ask me about the books over tea and bread. I think it was more out of a need for company than any real curiosity. I remember one such morning vividly. We were discussing a book I had returned and drinking tea with bread and jam. All I remember about that particular book was that it was large and flat and contained coloured illustrations of plants and flowers probably, and these would have interested Willie because of his bees. The morning was one of those still, true mornings in summer before the heat comes. The door was open on the yard. Earlier that morning he must have gone through his hives. The long grey beard was stained with food and drink and covered his shirt front. And while he was talking, some jam fell into his beard and set off an immediate buzzing. Without interrupting the flow of his talk, he shambled to the door, extracted the 2 or 3 errant bees caught in the beard, and flung them into the air of the yard. I continued coming to the house for books after the old beekeeper's death, but there was no longer any talk of books. Andy developed an interest in the land, but I fear it was as impractical as astronomy. Because of my constant presence about the house, I was drawn into some of those ventures, but their telling has no place here. I have often wondered why no curb was put on my reading at home. I can only put it down to a prejudice in favour of the gentle, eccentric Maronis and Protestants in general. At the time, Protestants were pitied because they were bound for hell in the next world, and they were considered to be abstemious, honest, and morally more correct than the general run of our fellow Catholics. This prejudice may well have extended to the library. The books may have been thought as harmless as their gentle owners. For whatever reason, the books were rarely questioned, and as long as they didn't take from work or prayer, I was allowed to read without hindrance. There are no days more full in childhood than those days that were not lived at all, the days lost in a favourite book. I remember waking out of one such book in the middle of the large living room in the barracks to find myself surrounded. My sisters had unlaced and removed one of my shoes and placed a straw hat on my head. Only when they began to move the wooden chair on which I sat away from the window did I wake out of the book, to their great merriment. Nowadays, only when I am writing am I able to find again that complete absorption when all sense of time is lost. Maybe once a year or 2. It's a strange and complete kind of happiness of looking up from the pages, thinking it is still 9 or 10 in the morning, to discover that it's past lunchtime, but there's no longer anyone who will test the quality of the absence by unlacing and removing a shoe. The library and those 2 gentlemen were to me a pure blessing.